So we can think that disowning, usually the reason we're disowning is because we think it's a benefit, but it's not. So when we see things with full wisdom, what wisdom means in this context is seeing things for what they are. And when we see things for what they are, aka disowning a part of ourselves or disowning a value system, is never going to be good in the long run. There's always something that we can integrate from it. Because if we're not integrating from it, it's going to be there anyway. It's just going to be rebellious towards us. So we have to make sure we are integrating that part of ourselves. And a lot of the time, if there's a part that feels hard done by, that doesn't feel integrated with the rest of us, then it will lead us to have doubt and question our uncertainty, which a lot of the time can be interpreted as questioning our self-worth, questioning our value, questioning our place in the world. Hey guys, welcome to The Real Reason That You Struggle with Self-Worth and How to Fix It, Holistic Blueprints to Deeply Rooted Self-Confidence. Now, this training, fairly self-explanatory, is for those people, it doesn't have to be somebody who is like really struggling with self-image, although this is going to help those people quite a lot. It just means that maybe in most of your life, you feel very confident, you feel very at ease, but there's a few certain key themes for you, maybe, or not themes, but areas where you feel like it just doesn't quite reach the same height as the rest of you. It can be the other way around, where most of the time you kind of feel like you're questioning your worth, you're questioning your self-esteem, and there's a few areas where you can kind of see the light. Or like I said, it can be maybe you're just going through a time period where it's kind of hard for you to see your self-value and reflect on it in a more accurate way. So this is going to help all of those people. But I would say that probably for most people they're going to fall under the category of, I actually feel pretty good most of the time. It's just there's a few areas where it doesn't seem to be easy for me. Like whether I'm an athlete and I'm competing, or whether it's asking for a raise, like that specific room where you have to go in and ask for your boss for a raise. It can be around dating and relationships. It can be about all of this stuff. Self-value and self-worth isn't something that's static or absolute necessarily. We have lots of different aspects of ourselves, lots of different themes, lots of different ways of constructing reality. Our self at work is very different to maybe ourself on our own. We need to be able to identify what these areas are and how to actually live life, not only where we have a lot of self-worth, but where self-worth isn't even a question to be asked because it's just so obvious. So this is the table of contents. First thing we're going to get into is how are you valuing yourself? Second thing we're going to be getting into is how are you valuing yourself in relation to the world that you are living in. This is not just, so whilst the first question is about how we're actually introspectively viewing ourselves, and I actually have a video that's coming out which is about how to become introspective. It's either already out or it's going to be coming out after this video. We need to actually look at how we are placing ourselves in the ecosystem of everything around us, whether that's in family relationships, whether that's in the actual societal structure that we are in, the culture, everything like that. So we can go, like I said, right straight here. We can go in a personal sense, a societal, cultural sense, and a big scale, existential scale. So we need to understand where we're placing ourselves in all of these different scales. Otherwise, there will be things that we will miss, which will just make the problem worse, and it will not make the problem go away. Are there any shadows? This is the third section. Are there any shadows that are distorting your self-perception? Basically what this means is if there's any narratives or beliefs or identities that are holding us back, we need to actually get to the root of those and heal those at the root, rather than just adding a framework or just adding a mental framework, a mental reframe, because that is not going to solve the issue, unfortunately. And then the last one is, how are we creating suffering for ourselves when there is only pain? And I put in brackets here, pain is inevitable and suffering is optional. We'll get into that in the fourth section. So the first section, how are we valuing ourselves? Or how are you valuing yourself, rather, for those watching this? What is the structure of how you're thinking? What are the value systems of how you're thinking? What is the overall stage you're at? And then there's all of these books which I have referenced here: Spiral Dynamics by Christopher Cohen and Don Beck, Ego Development Theory by Suzanne Cook-Greuter, and Stages International by Terry O'Fallon. The structure of how you are thinking is extremely important to how you are evaluating your self-worth. Because for most people, I'm saying this like for like 99% of people, the way in which they are constructing their value is the problem, which is why they would have issues of low self-esteem, low confidence, low self-worth, whatever you want to call it. It's because they're seeing all of these things which they are not living up to, but then they're unable to see and unable to evaluate and appreciate and have compassion for all of these things which they are doing well. So an example would be somebody who maybe has, this is like a bit, not even an extreme example, this is actually extremely common. Someone has like a good job, right, in it's like a doctor or a nurse or something, a job which they're really helping people, they're doing well, they're taking care of themselves, but they have a strong desire to be more independent, to have a bit more of a achiever competition mindset. Now what that would mean is maybe they would want to be looking at entrepreneurship. And if they're not an entrepreneur, if they're constantly slaving away 9 to 5 as they would view it, then that's actually somehow a loss. And if we are constructing reality in that way, then it means that we cannot see the value and the amount of time it took to get to be a doctor or a nurse or something like that. Now, I say this is a more extreme example because it could seem like that on the surface, because you're like, yeah, but you had to go for all the school and you're doing all this cool stuff, and it's valued as a person and it's valued as a job in society. Now, some people in healthcare would definitely argue with that. They would say they're not valued enough. I never worked in healthcare, so I wouldn't be able to give you satisfactory answer on that. But the reason why we are saying that is because clearly, if you can appreciate that, it is in your worldview of how you are constructing reality that is something good. We are talking about somebody who is unable to see the value in it because it's just not in their worldview. So this is what I mean by the structure of how you are thinking. First of all, there's tons of maps out there, which is exactly what I'm giving you here. Terry O'Fallon, spiral dynamics, ego development theory. I mean, we got a diagram of it right here. We need to see the rough ways of how our ego can develop and then see what is it applying to me right now. Have I actually got a successful life, but it's just not success in the way that I want it to be? Now, that's something to pay attention to. It's not something I want to brush under the rug. If there's something you don't like about your life, that's definitely something to pay attention to. I'm not going to try and say it's not anything that's relevant. But being unable to see the value which you're already bringing is a blind spot. And this can be solved by solving the structure of how you are thinking. So this is also pays attention to value systems, like I said. For somebody who's able to see, oh yeah, like healthcare is a valued pillar of society. For somebody who hasn't integrated that value system yet, or their way of viewing a pillar of society is different, because remember, it is all subjective when it comes to this stuff, then they will not be able to value that, which will then lead to them thinking that they're wasting their life, they're not doing what they want to do, and then that leads to them coming to the conclusion that they're not confident, and then when they come to the conclusion they're not confident, that affects their physiology. When that affects their physiology, it affects how they're being treated, and that reinforces the whole cycle and just goes in this endless downward spiral. What is the overall stage that you're at? This is dynamic, okay? It also depends on what kind of theme you're working at. So somebody could have, so if we look at this diagram right here, we have self-centric, group-centric, skill-centric, self-determining, self-questioning, self-actualizing, construct-aware, unitive, all this kind of stuff. She calls it a little bit different in the paper, but we'll see it here. If you're at the stage where you are self-determining and you're really trying to understand what is really going on inside of you and understanding how that works and how you can actualize that into real life, but you're stuck in a group-centric or skill-centric job, skill-centric being you're really good at maybe helping somebody go from 9 to 5 to starting their own business, there's a gap there. This gap isn't bad at all. But if we, depending on how our constructs are set up, if we are viewing that gap as bad, if we're saying, oh no, but I'm doing all this work is just not very important, what I should be helping is help people become more self-determining because that's where I'm at, that can actually be a knock and a lack of self-confidence and not valuing ourselves properly, which will lead to all of these different issues of like having a lack of confidence and certainty and self-belief, which just stops you from being able to move from the next stage anyway. So this is the first thing I wanted to get into, because we will get into the actual insecurities and how to actually overcome insecurities when it comes to self-worth, because that's obviously a very, very big topic. But I wanted to give you this system first to kind of switch things up a little bit and also realize that there's so many different keys to the kingdom. There's so many different paths that you can take. There's also so many different paths you can take to question your value, unfortunately. So it cuts both ways. You can have, it's a double-edged sword basically. There's so many paths you can take to liberate yourself, but there's also so many paths you can take to place yourself in chains. Most of the time where you're at is not the problem, unless it's distorted, obviously, or unless it's an immature version of whatever the stage that you're supposed to be at. So if you're an achiever, that's actually, all stages are perfect in and of themselves. But if you're at more of an achiever stage, that is distorted, where it's just about achievement and you can't, and it hasn't integrated the rest of the stages, or there's certain blind spots, and that would be a bit of a tough time for you. And unless you just win constantly, which is just not possible. And we'll talk about how to overcome that in step 3. It's usually the fact that you haven't fully integrated a stage beforehand. Like I said, every stage is perfect, or every stage is beautiful, should I say. Nothing's perfect. So these are parts that then become disowned, rebellious, and they cause confusion and chaos. Now, what this means is that we have to do our homework. This is obviously what my one-on-one coaching does for you, is you have to see where your blind spots are, which is notoriously difficult to do on your own, especially if it's something new, but this will give you the best shot at doing it, in my opinion. And you have to see, have I disowned something about the earlier stage? Is there something that's not fully integrated? A clear sign of this is if after you've done a bit of research, or maybe you're already familiar with ego development and already familiar with integral theory, all that kind of stuff, is there a stage which you were extra judgmental about, that you were extra cautious about, that you maybe have a bit of a defense mechanism around, whatever that means to you? This is a telltale sign, and how that will show up in your body, most likely, again, this is how it shows up for me and a lot of my clients, but it's not the be-all end-all, so it's not like the Bible or anything, is there's some kind of tension or resistance internally inside of you. This is an extremely good way of seeing what stages are not fully integrated. You should be able to see every stage without judging it. And also, if you catch yourself judging something, please do not use that as an excuse to judge yourself. That's not what I'm saying here, okay? But that's a really good way of seeing what parts of you aren't integrated and what parts of you are possibly in a blind spot. AKA, to continue on from my point before, if I'm at a very healthy, inhabiting a stage that's very healthy, there's no problem. But if there's something that we are disowning, it can create friction in how we are viewing ourselves, leading to a friction existence. That's a term that I coined, so pat myself on the back, where we should all be good and yet we are not. Or we should be all good and yet we're not. So we obviously don't want to be living in a friction existence. I would say that's pretty self-explanatory, but if we just live with a lot of friction, then it just makes things much more painful, much more uncomfortable. So we can think that disowning, usually the reason we're disowning is because we think it's a benefit, but it's not. So when we see things with full wisdom, what wisdom means in this context is seeing things for what they are. And when we see things for what they are, aka disowning a part of ourselves or disowning a value system, is never going to be good in the long run. There's always something that we can integrate from it. Because if we're not integrating from it, it's going to be there anyway. It's just going to be rebellious towards us. So we have to make sure we are integrating that part of ourselves. And a lot of the time, if there's a part that feels hard done by, that doesn't feel integrated with the rest of us, then it will lead us to have doubt and question our uncertainty, which a lot of the time can be interpreted as questioning our self-worth, questioning our value, questioning our place in the world. So point 2, valuing yourself in relation to the world we are living in. Is there a disconnect between who you feel on the inside and the reality of what is happening on the outside? This is really key right here, so I'll pause for a moment. This is important because this is essentially like reality checking ourselves. So if we feel like this really confident person, or we feel like somebody who really, where value isn't even a question, that's the part we want to get to, by the way. It's not like, oh yeah, I have a ton of value, because that is still very flimsy. Where it doesn't even come up as a question when it means that there's doubt cannot even arise. But then as soon as we go out and we try and make a friend, or we try and have a bit of banter with a shopkeeper. This is such a random example, but I used to want to be a magician when I was like super young, and you'd have to want to perform in front of people in like a place called Spitalfields Market. It's quite famous now in London. That was nerve-wracking, right? It was tough, even though I was offering a service and I didn't want to get paid or anything like that. It was just a bit of enjoyment. I wanted to go and give something to somebody to help make their day better, but it was still very nerve-wracking to me. At this point, I was still able to say hi to some people. But what I mean is that if you were to go into that situation, this was you and you were to go into that situation and you were not able to do that, then this is a reality check in our mind, okay? We always want to put practical real world experience first. That is not an exception. That's actually the rule. Because it's when there's more stresses, it's when there's a more stressful environment, it's when there's more stuff going on, that the truth of our situation becomes much, much more clear. That's why the matrix that my mentor, who I talk about all the time, Pierre D'Souza, came up with, which is whatever the most boring, whatever is the most difficult, and whatever is the most intimidating. This is your free ticket system to actually check if you've done the correct work properly. So in other words, if you feel really confident and feel really good when you're doing all of this, when you're just at home or you're in a comfort zone, but then as soon as you're outside of that comfort zone, it doesn't even have to be outside of that comfort zone, just outside of your familiarity, that's when all this stuff becomes much, much more challenging. This is the reality check where you're like, oh, this is actually not the exception. This is much more likely to be the rule, because when things are not going smoothly, that's when the reality of your situation shows up. So this obviously is happening with career, relationships, friendships, goals, drive, etc. aka have things manifested. I'm not a big fan of manifestation at all, but have they manifested outside or not? Has all of this work I've been doing, yes, it can make me subjectively feel better, which is great, which is amazing. That is a breakthrough in and of itself. So really, really, I'm not just saying it, congratulations. That is really cool that you have made your subjective experience noticeably better. But if our external does not reflect these changes back to us, it still means there's work for us to do. It still means most likely that either we need more time. So it's not just like we should panic. If these things haven't shown up, we shouldn't just panic. But it can be a time thing. Like if you just started 3 months ago and you've just been focusing on the internal and not feeling bad, and that's cleared up, and now you're starting to look more external goals, yeah, you have more time. But if you've been working on something for a long time and it still has yet to show up, first of all, we have to have patience and compassion for ourselves. But second of all, it is a good reality check. We should not be using a reality check, this is extremely important, to berate or belittle ourselves. Okay, because that just makes the problem worse and it makes it go on for longer. So it's just a lose-lose-lose if we do that. But we do use it as something, okay, there's something for me to look at. There's something which I'm not quite getting. And that's when actually a second opinion, whether it's your friend, not just any friend, but a friend who's able to hold you in a non-judgmental place, or a mentor or a coach, is extremely, extremely important. That's how I actually 10x'd my progress, because I started being caught in my own blind spots, and I actually had a game plan by somebody who wasn't just, a few steps ahead of me, but a decade or 5 years ahead of me, half a decade in front of me, so they could actually see the pathway for me, but not just the pathway for me, but how that was going to look years ahead. That's why that's so important. And that's why if you don't have access to a coach or you just are not ready, if you're going to speak to a friend, you need to have someone with that kind of level of maturity, at least. So it doesn't have to be instant, is what I'm trying to get across. But are you actually taking the steps to do the things you want to do? Or are you just drinking a green juice and trying to vibrate $1 million into existence on your couch? So obviously the version of Aaron who wrote that had a bit more of an attitude. Latino Aaron, we can call him. That's Latino Aaron right there. I used that as a bit of humor, but also to kind of demonstrate what this actually is like. How magical thinking a lot of people get trapped in with manifesting and all this other kind of stuff. Like, yes, subjectively not feeling bad anymore has real effects, because if you don't feel bad and you feel confident and very loving, you're going to attract these people more into your life because they just like to be around those people more. Not even from an energy perspective, just people like being around that more. The power of likability is immense. If you have less suffering, then you attract less suffering into your life, and you'll be able to move around things much easier. But if there's not a practical showing up practice to get you from A to B, then just relying on that is basically like trying to vibrate $1 million back into your life. It's just not going to happen unless if you're extremely lucky. I included this perspective, like I said, to create a harmonious picture of what could be going wrong. Most of the time, it will be subjectively led. From my past experience, at least, when it comes to the issue of self-esteem. So to bring this back to self-worth, another thing, now this is a theory that I have, so take this with whatever you mean by this. If we're doing all of this stuff, but we're not actually doing any practical things in the real world, this will, if we're not aware of it, or if we're pushing it down, will unconsciously make us less confident. Because we know there's a part of us that we're not owning. We know there's a part of us which we're not showing up. We know there's an area of life which we're not showing up in. Which is why for this whole point, I've talked about this the whole time, because the one person you cannot lie to is yourself. You can become very good at misleading yourself, but in terms of fully lying to yourself, it's just not going to happen because you are yourself. There's nothing you can escape yourself. So if there's something which you're not owning, that's going to affect your confidence moving forward. For most people who maybe don't have the most fluency with their internal world, which is totally normal, I'm not having a go at you, especially when it comes to negative stuff, because when it comes to negative stuff, we're going to have less fluency around it to begin with because it's just less pleasant to investigate. It's very confronting, especially if it's something that's a real deep insecurity. That's totally normal if you feel that way. So if we have less fluency, how do we get around this? It might not be a self-esteem issue, but it could be kind of a healthy response to give you a kick up the ass or to change something about yourself. So this doesn't really cover if we have an actual insecurity, okay? Which I'm sure a lot of you do, which don't worry, we're gonna get to in point 3. But problems don't just come on their own. A lot of the time they come with other things. So this is something to include, like I said, it's a holistic guide, because maybe the reason we don't feel fully confident in something is because we don't have the full experience in something. We have innocence in something. And it's not a shadow work issue, it's not an insecurity issue, it's because we're actually just not doing the work. And if we're just not doing the work, then the answer becomes very simple. We have to actually show up 1% every day, compound interest, and in the next to no time, we're doing so much more than we would have already done. Now that's a topic for a slightly different video, but I had to include this to make sure that we're not just tunnel visioning on a certain issue. So for example, right, if you're about to compete in something, you do not want to be not nervous. Because if you're not nervous, then I can say this as someone who's competed in jiu-jitsu all the way up to an international level, there's a certain bandwidth of energy you kind of need to get into in a fight or flight response. Now, if you're in a fight, you don't have a flight response, so that's a whole other thing to navigate. But there's a certain, every time I was kind of not nervous for a competition, I always just performed lackluster. That's the funny thing, it wasn't even bad, it was just lackluster. Because there's a point of intensity which I wasn't able to get to, which the nerves helps you with. So we actually don't want to block off maybe an impulse which is telling us we're not doing enough, because that enables us to get into that heightened state and able to almost reach terminal escape velocity of an emotional state to break us through the apathy that we're going through to get us to actually go into action. The other thing I wanted to say on this before we move to the next point is sometimes we do not have the right to be confident. Now what that means is it doesn't mean intrinsically we do not have the right. Of course everyone has the right to be confident, but in this example, if we're trying to feel confident about the World Championships of Jiu-Jitsu, and we've done our due diligence 6 to 8 hours a day, every single day, and we've structured it properly, we had enough rest, we've eaten the right things, we've cut weight in the right way, then yes, we have a right to be confident, right? It's almost like a relative right to be confident. But if we're trying to win the World Championships and we haven't done any of those things and we've slacked off, it's almost like, yes, you can just be confident because it's your internal world, you can just do whatever, but there's a reality which you're disowning there, which is you didn't do the work. And maybe having that experience of doubting yourself and then getting smashed in the competition means that you won't do it the next time. So what I'm saying is maybe part of what you're experiencing is part of a regulated emotional system. To have that regulated emotional system where there's actually a part of you which is honest with yourself and being like, maybe I shouldn't be really confident about that. Like for an example, if you, whatever the issue is that you're struggling with right now, which most likely made you click on this video, whatever that is, now I'm not trying to belittle it at all. I'm just giving you an extra perspective, which is, okay, there might be a big shadow here for sure, but is it maybe because I haven't done my homework? Is it maybe because I'm trying to bite off a bit more than I can chew and that I've disowned doing this part of myself? So now I'm just expecting myself to be really smooth and confident at this, but I haven't actually done my homework leading up. Just a perspective, right? So this is why I included that. Now we get to the meat and potatoes of what most of you would have clicked on this, which is shadows and distortions of the self. Is there conditions on your self-esteem, love, and acceptance? So shadows will distort our view of ourselves. We have introjections, we have projections, we have split ego states. So for introjections, this is a belief that we have internalized, that we have taken from an outside external stimulus. This can be something that happened to us, this can be an environment over time, this can be somebody literally telling us that you're not good enough. This is something which was not present in us before. How you can, if you're having trouble maybe believing this, or just accepting this, right? Because I don't need to take this as just belief. You can think, did I have the belief that I wasn't good enough when I was first born? The answer is no. So what that means is it had to have come from somewhere. Now, if you do believe that, I've literally never met anyone who does believe that they were born with that, then that is an issue in and of itself that we would have to work with directly, which is feeling that everything's self-determined and all that kind of stuff. So I guess for you, you can just follow along, or you can work on that, because that is an introjection that, oh yeah, I was just born this way, or I was cursed. It's a belief that we've taken, a narrative that we've taken, a storyline we've taken, and we've made it about us. So for introjections, we have to let them go. We have to give them back. This is where the letting go stuff is really, really helpful. All the letting go starts to break down is when it comes to projections and introjections. So for somebody who's watching this right now, I would say that for like 80% of you, an introjection will be what caused you to click on this video. At least a big part of it, right? Because this is the meat and potatoes of shadow work. Now for projections, these usually sit on top of introjections. So some people might not even realize that they have this, but when they do the healing process for the projection, they just feel so much more empowered. So this is why we cannot skip projections, because it's not that we don't believe that we are capable of worthy having a self-esteem, but rather we are projecting any ideas of just self-esteem in general onto others, or projecting worthiness onto others. For example, how projections and introjections work with each other is like this. We have an introjection which is at the root. The projection is also at the root of the issue, but it's at the top here. So if we have the introjection, that's where I started explaining introjections. I'm not good enough. Most of the time that will come with a projection, and that projection will be, okay, if I had the belief that I'm not good enough, I can either get angry at people who do act confident, or I can really idolize them and put them on the pedestal. That's me projecting ideas of worthiness. The reason why I can see worthiness and confidence in somebody else is because I have that capacity within me. So for projections, you have to reach out and take that energy back and take that empowerment back. Now, projections are underrated because when you take that empowerment back, you feel more empowered. You feel more powerful. You feel much, much more alive. You feel like you have much, much more energy, which makes the rest of this work really, really, or much, much easier. Because suddenly things are no longer happening to you, they're happening from you. However, in some ways, they're the most tricky because it requires a radical amount of self-honesty and taking responsibility for yourself. Because that's what it is, it's taking responsibility for yourself. You no longer get the luxury of blaming the world, of doing this thing and that thing to you. You are now at the cause and the effect. So that's a projection. Split ego states are the most complex. This is why, it's for this reason why, and also for the other two. Obviously I have kind of like a time restriction. I have to fit it into the rest of this video. I have my free comprehensive shadow work guide, the most practical guide to shadow work on the internet, in the link below. It's completely free. You just got to give your email and I'll send it over to you via email. And this is a 3-hour comprehensive breakdown, which I have originally actually gave to my paying clients. You will see my paying clients on that live stream, just a couple of them. And then I decided to release it for free for you guys on YouTube, because it will give you the A to Z of what shadows are, how they work, why they work, and then how you can actually heal at the unconscious root level, so that you don't just heal one shadow, but you heal dozens of shadows at once. Okay? Because I was looking around, I didn't really see a guide that was out there that was this comprehensive for free to help people get started, that was able to comprehensively heal them so that people wouldn't let go of projections for instance, which just causes so much more damage in the long term. If you get this guide, you will not fall into these traps. You will not get stuck. That's the reason I made it. If that sounds interesting to you, it's in the link below. And the reason why this split ego states triggered that for me is because this is the most complex. This is the most moving parts. I go into it into much, much more detail in the product, like I talked about. Maybe we do have a strong self-esteem, specific areas and parts of us. But maybe in another specific area and part, there's a part of us which has a strong gravitational pull, and that kind of collapses the rest of our identity into itself. What that means in real term is I feel confident in a lot of areas, but when it comes to dating, I just don't believe in myself. And it's because there's a localized part. Now, there's also probably an introjection there as well, but it's because there's a part there which is walled off from the rest of us, a part that doesn't feel as mature as the rest of us. It still feels like a little kid or a little adolescent trying to get approval from others, which is just inherently repelling. This makes us appear less confident than we ought to in specific situations. So a telltale sign of a part is something which just doesn't fit the mold of the rest of us. And It's not like an insecurity, like we don't feel small, although we can feel small like an introjection would. It just feels like there's a part of us which, it just feels like we get a sense that there's something which is not quite at the same stage as the rest of us. This is a split ego state. Now in the guide I go into, it's a whole 4-week game plan to get you started from 0 to hero, basically, in the shadow work journey. And I go into much more detail about how to actually go into healing these. But the healing method for split ego states, if introjection was letting go, projection was reown, split ego states is reintegrate. That's what you have to do there. And all of these shadows place conditions on us. A condition on our love, a condition on our acceptance, a condition on how we view ourselves. We shouldn't even have to ask the question, are we confident? Do we have self-esteem? Do we have self-worth? Because that question implies that there's doubt. That question implies that there's anything other. There just is. The paradigm itself of self-worth is inherently limiting. So ideally, when we're doing all of the healing work, that's the stage that we want to aim for. That's like the Shangri-La, right? That's like the promised land, basically. And then the fourth one, and the final part of this, after we've kind of gone into the shadow work, which is probably going to be the most relevant for everyone, which is why there's a whole free guide for you guys. Are you creating excess suffering for yourself? So one of my teachers, Sister Kanti Kema, Sasana Dipika, had a quote, "Pain in this life is inevitable. It's the suffering that is optional." Are we creating unnecessary suffering for ourselves when there's just pain? Like, it is a painful experience to know deep down that for whatever reason, your constructs, your mind, this sense of Aaron does not fully believe in yourself. That's painful, okay? But we don't need to be creating extra storylines out of that. Oh, this means I'm cursed, or this means I'm this or that. That just creates extra emotional baggage, which we're just gonna have to end up healing later, either by yourself or with a coach. We need to have a big picture perspective on this too, that yes, pain is inevitable, but suffering comes from us and is entirely self-created. Again, this is a radical level for a lot of people of self-responsibility. It definitely was for me when I first started, because you no longer get to blame other things around you. So this is my more kind of Theravadan lineage speaking, as you can tell, my more kind of Buddhist Theravadan lineage speaking. So we need to have practices in place in this guide. You know, like I said, it's a holistic guide, so here's the holistic part of it. We need to make sure we have practices in place to make sure that whilst we're on this healing journey, whilst we're on this self-actualization journey, we are not creating any extra baggage for ourselves. So in other words, we need to know how to not create a narrative for ourselves, which is harmful. So this will stop extra shadows from being created, as well as a much more pleasant existence for us in general. So the practice which I recommend to you for this is TWIM, Tranquil Wisdom Insight Meditation by the Dharma Sukha Foundation, founded by Bhante Vimalaramsi. So Bhante Vimalaramsi, my teacher's teacher, was apparently declared fully enlightened in his Burmese tradition or Thai tradition. I never remember which one it is. And he'd been doing the breath meditation for about 20 years. However, he felt like he wasn't fully enlightened. So again, a lot of self-honesty, a lot of self-responsibility. He got told that he made the final liberation, but it didn't feel like that. So he went back and he read the suttas. The suttas are like the original discourses of the Buddha, and he founded this new method. You don't have to go into the mythology of it. You don't have to go into the religiosity of it if you don't want to. This is just the best way I have learned for grounding yourself in a very loving state. So we've been talking about having love this whole time, having love and acceptance for yourself this whole time, because it just makes it so much more easy. You know, Carl Rogers, one of the best therapists of all time, or one of the most revolutionary therapists of all time, human-centered therapy, client-centered therapy, said that the more you accept yourself, the easier it is to change. And it's the same for this. The more you have unconditional love for yourself, the easier it is to go through this changing process. So TWIM is an amazing method for that, and it's the best system to be able to look at your mind from beyond and not get caught up in the mind. So what this means is, when we're going through all of this stuff, all of the 3 points before, this is mind, it's in the mind, that's great. However, if we don't know how to see that the mind is in itself very transient and not us, we are not the mind, then it makes it much easier to create extra storylines for ourselves, which is just extra emotional baggage for us to clean up afterward. So that's what I recommend for you, and I will leave that there. So if you have any questions, let me know. I'm happy to do video responses for you. I have a whole playlist on replying to people who have questions. What I would say is the first 2 points are just kind of there as homework, framework, make sure that we're not getting lost in the problem. But number 3 is the most important: shadows and how we're distorting ourselves and all that kind of stuff. And I recommend the most practical guide to shadow work on the internet because it's free, and I made it extremely comprehensive. So you should just be able to do root cause healing from the get-go, so we can actually get transformational change and not just incremental change. And that is it for today. Enjoy.